I was at that exciting age of early adolescence, around 13 years old, when my parents first started trusting me to stay home alone overnight. This was a thrilling development for me, as I finally felt a sense of independence and responsibility. The only condition was that I couldn't leave the house or have anyone over, which I was perfectly fine with. On this particular night, my parents were traveling to attend a relative's wedding in a neighboring city. Before they left, my mom sat me down and went through a detailed list of do's and don'ts. She put a list of important phone numbers on the fridge, emergency services, neighbors, the hotel they'd be staying at. She also left me some pre-prepared meals in the fridge and made sure I promised to eat a proper dinner. As soon as they left, a sense of freedom washed over me. The house was all mine for a whole night. I started by cranking up the music, something I could never do when my dad was home. The bass thumped through the house and I danced around the living room, reveling in my solitude. The weather that evening seemed to match my mood perfectly. Dark clouds had been gathering all afternoon, and just as night fell, the first drops of rain began to patter against the windows. I've always loved thunderstorms, finding them oddly comforting. I turned off the music and sat by the window, watching as lightning illuminated the sky and thunder rolled in the distance. After enjoying the storm for a while, I decided it was the perfect time to indulge in my favorite pastime, gaming. But not just any gaming session. Tonight, I could play on the big screen. I carefully unplugged my Xbox from my room and carried it downstairs to the den, where my dad's massive flat-screen TV and Bose sound system waited. This was a rare treat, only possible when I had the house to myself. The den was a half flight of stairs down from the living room level with the backyard. The back door was in this room, which would later become a crucial detail. But at that moment, all I cared about was setting up my game. I booted up Black Ops, my favorite game at the time, and joined an online multiplayer party with my friend Cody. The surround sound made every gunshot and explosion feel incredibly real. I had my old headset on, which only allowed me to hear other players in the lobby. For a 13-year-old, this was absolute paradise. Time flew by as Cody and I played match after match. We were on a winning streak, our teamwork honed by countless hours of practice. The storm outside added an extra layer of atmosphere to our intense gaming session. Every now and then, a particularly loud clap of thunder would make me jump, but it only added to the excitement. It must have been past 9 o'clock when something interrupted my gaming bliss. At first, I wasn't sure if I had really heard it over the game sounds, but then it came again, the distinct chime of the doorbell. I paused the game, telling Cody, "Hold up, I think someone's at the door." Cody's voice crackled through my headset. "Dude, it's super late. Who could that be?" I wondered the same thing. Could my parents be back early? But no, they had keys. They wouldn't ring the doorbell. A neighbor, perhaps, checking on me. But in this weather? "Maybe you should go check," Cody suggested, curiosity evident in his voice. I hesitated. My parents had been very clear about not opening the door to anyone, but surely just checking wouldn't hurt. I told Cody I'd be right back and headed upstairs. Standing in front of the door, I called out, "Who's there?" My voice cracked a little, betraying my nervousness. A male voice responded from the other side, "I need to use a phone." My heart started racing. This wasn't anyone I knew. I didn't answer, instead retreating back downstairs to the den. But I had made a grave mistake. I had let whoever was out there know that someone was home. Back at my game, I quickly told Cody what had happened. His reaction was immediate. "Yo, what the fuck? Don't open the door, man!" I assured him I hadn't and wouldn't. We tried to resume our game, but I was distracted now. Every sound from outside made me tense up. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. Cody and I fell silent, listening. After a minute or two of nothing, we breathed sighs of relief. Whoever it was must have left. Gradually, I started to relax again. The game pulled me back in, and soon I was lost in the virtual world once more. The storm outside had intensified, rain lashing against the windows and thunder booming overhead. It was in this moment of renewed calm that it happened. A movement caught my eye, and I turned my head just in time to see the back door closing. A tall figure stepped inside, definitely not my dad. Pure terror gripped me. I dropped the controller, the cord of my headset ripping out as I bolted for the office door. I slammed it shut behind me, fumbling with the lock. The second it clicked into place, the handle rattled violently as someone on the other side tried to open it. My mind raced. The office had 2 doors, one to the den where I'd just come from, and one leading to the garage. That was my only chance to escape. But I couldn't move. I stood frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Then came a knock on the door. The man's voice, deceptively calm, called out, "Little boy, I just need to use your phone. I was stranded out in the rain." I remained silent, hoping against hope that he might leave. But instead, the knocking turned to pounding. His voice grew louder, angrier. "Open the door, you little shit!" he yelled, the door shaking in its frame as he tried to break it down. I knew I had no choice. I had to get out through the garage. I pressed the button to open the garage door, praying the noise wouldn't alert the intruder. As soon as it was high enough, I ducked under and ran out into the storm. Rain soaked me instantly as I sprinted down the street. I headed for Julian's house, our neighbor a few doors down. I used to play with his dog, Copper, when I was younger. I could hear Copper barking as I frantically rang the doorbell, constantly looking back towards my house. Julian opened the door, confusion turning to concern as he saw my state. I threw myself into his arms, begging for help between sobs. His wife appeared from the kitchen, alarmed by the commotion. As I recounted what had happened, their expressions changed from shock to determination. Julian immediately called the police while his wife wrapped me in a warm blanket and tried to calm me down. The wait for the police felt endless. Julian stayed on the phone with the dispatcher, relaying information and keeping an eye out the window. His wife made me some hot cocoa, which I could barely drink through my shaking hands. Finally, we saw the flashing lights of police cars pulling up outside. Julian and I went out to meet them. I repeated my story to the officers, my voice steadier now but still trembling. When they asked which door was unlocked, I told them about the back door in the den. A couple of officers entered through the garage, guns drawn. The rest of us waited outside in tense silence. After what seemed like an eternity, they emerged with a man in handcuffs. They were careful to keep him from seeing me. Once he was secure in a police car, an officer approached me to ask if I knew the man. I shook my head emphatically. No, of course I don't know him. The man was clearly intoxicated or possibly on drugs. He was ranting loudly, insisting that it was his house and that I was his son. His behavior was erratic and aggressive, confirming my fear that he was dangerous. The officers informed us that he would be taken to jail and charged with criminal trespass. They would need to contact my parents about how they wanted to proceed with pressing charges. Later, I learned the man's name was John McCarty. While it was somewhat reassuring that this seemed to be a random encounter rather than someone specifically targeting our house, it didn't entirely ease my fears. The thought that this man would one day be out of jail and knew where I lived was terrifying. In the days that followed, my parents took several measures to increase our home security. They installed a more robust alarm system and added extra locks to all the doors. They also had a serious talk with me about safety protocols when home alone. The incident left a lasting impact on me. For weeks I struggled to sleep, jumping at every sound in the night. My parents arranged for me to see a counselor to help process the trauma. Gradually, with support from my family and professionals, I began to feel safe in my own home again. This experience taught me valuable lessons about personal safety and the importance of following rules set by parents. It also made me appreciate the security of having my family around. While I eventually regained the privilege of staying home alone, it was never quite the same carefree experience it had been before. Years later, as an adult, I still think about that night sometimes. It serves as a reminder of how quickly a normal situation can turn dangerous, and the importance of being prepared and aware of one's surroundings. While it was a frightening experience, I'm grateful for the quick thinking that helped me escape and the support I received in the aftermath. The story of that stormy night has become a part of our family lore, retold at gatherings as a cautionary tale. It's a stark reminder that even in seemingly safe environments, unexpected dangers can arise. But it's also a story of resilience, of how a scared teenager managed to keep his wits about him in a crisis. Today, my parents still live in that house. When I visit, I can't help but glance at that back door in the den, remembering the fear I felt seeing it open that night. But I also remember the strength I found within myself, the kindness of our neighbors, and the efficiency of the emergency services that came to my aid. This experience has shaped my approach to home security in my own adult life. I'm perhaps more cautious than most, always double-checking locks and being wary of unexpected visitors. But I've also learned not to let fear control my life. Instead, I've channeled that experience into being prepared and aware, skills that have served me well in various aspects of my life. In the end, what could have been a tragic story became one of survival and growth. It's a night I'll never forget, but also one that I've learned to move beyond, carrying its lessons with me as I navigate the world. It was a minute past midnight on a humid August Saturday in Manhattan, and I sat alone in my office. From 12 stories below, I could hear the drunken yelling of the night. From what I could make out, the crowd on the sidewalk was in good spirits. There was laughing and a good deal of drunken whooping. I smiled. It was good to hear happy voices even from a distance. I sat in the dark, trying to cherish the warm feeling for a few moments. Then my phone lit up and vibrated against the mahogany desk where I had left it. I read the message. It was a notification from the car service. My driver had arrived. I stood up and took one last look around my office, a massive room 12 feet from floor to ceiling, with the entire western wall made of thick windows. The office was ostentatious for a workplace, indulgent in decoration, and conspicuous in location. The room's massive windows were perfectly suited to flood the room with bright sunlight during the day, but in the black of night, they only revealed the distant lights of a restless city. Even after 6 years, I still felt alone in the city at night. Lights of the endless concrete grid revealed the uncountable silhouettes of cyclopean skyscrapers. The darkened office sat on the 24th floor of a towering gray building. I hated this place. I had spent nearly every day of the past 6 years in the confines of this office, but nothing about the place was mine. It was my father's office, not mine. The office, the entire floor it was located on, and the law firm that owned it were all my father's. I had only followed the old man here, but I would go on no longer. My father was dead, and I was leaving this place forever. I had found out about my father's death the previous Monday, and had spent the last week handling the old man's business. The memories of the days spent handling the will began to crowd in on me, but I pushed them aside. That was enough, I thought, as I took one last look over the cavernous office. It was over, I thought to myself. I never had to think about the man again. With that thought, I turned around, picked up my suitcase, which I had left lying by the door, and exited the darkened office. I made my way across a sea of red carpet and looked out at the horizon of endless cubicles. The entire floor was silent but for the fluorescent lights that buzzed above me and the distant sound of typing. Someone else was here. There always was at this hour. Someone who either didn't want to go home or had nothing to go back to. That person had once been me, I admitted to myself, but never again. My father had seen to that. When I reached the elevators, I pressed the button and watched the yellow L flicker to life. I shouldered my rucksack and settled for a minute of waiting. With a momentary pause, thoughts of my father returned. When I had seen the will, I had thought that in death, my father had finally done me a kindness. The old man had left me nearly everything. I had been left a sizable inheritance, all my father's possessions, nearly everything except a place in the law firm. When I had seen that, I had felt immense relief. It seemed at last that my father had come to know me. I hated law. I hated the firm. And most of all, I hated New York. With the old man's death, I had been freed. The elevator dinged as it finished its ascent, and as its metallic doors opened, I returned to the present moment and stepped inside. When the doors closed behind me, and I felt myself begin to descend, another thought came to me. Who made you come here in the first place? That question tore away any pretenses of warmth for my late father. It was the old man, after all, who had made me come to the city in the first place. The elevator continued its slow descent. I stewed. It was my father who made me go to law school in the first place, my father who forced me out of my home in Vermont, and my father who brought me to Manhattan. The elevator doors opened again, and I stepped out into the lobby. The office building had a grand entryway. The vaulted ceilings were gilded in gold and silver, and intricate Art Deco patterns were plastered over its massive marble walls. Everything about the place seemed wrong to me, from the falsity of crystal lights overhead down to the chemically cleaned carpet beneath my feet. I sped up to reach my car before it left. I only slowed down when I reached the lobby's front desk, which was still manned even in the little hours of the morning. I stopped a moment and nodded toward the night doorman. The other man nodded back, and we exchanged a wordless goodbye. And with that, I stepped out into the humid summer night. The street was nearly empty. The revelers I had heard minutes before had by now moved on. The night seemed to be void of all life but for me and a few strangers waiting for the lights to change at the corner. It was eerie for New York, even at midnight. I pulled my blazer a little tighter around my chest despite the heat and looked around for my driver. I saw my car was waiting for me at the curb, and when I approached it, a voice called out from the open driver's side window. I heard a man's voice. "Newark Airport?" the voice asked. I didn't reply. I only nodded and stepped inside the cab. I hadn't even finished buckling my seatbelt before the car had sped off down Fifth Avenue. I watched the familiar gray views of the previous 6 years flash by as we drove. Restaurants and offices, storefronts and hotels all began to dissipate into a concrete slurry as the city blocks blurred and melded under the soft glow of streetlights and against the rush of tires on pavement. I watched the ephemeral city lights from the car window for a moment before turning away and checking my phone. It would be another half an hour before we reached the Newark Airport. The cab turned again, and I stifled a yawn as I leaned against my seat. The lights continued to flash overhead, and the city sights flew past me, but I had stopped watching. Despite my best efforts, the lack of sleep had taken its toll, and I dozed off into a restless sleep. When I opened my eyes, I saw a room empty of life and covered in a thick blanket of heavy darkness. I was in a bed, and as I looked around, I noticed more. I saw a blue dresser, a small child-sized chair, and an open window. The window had been propped open, but there was no moonlight to be seen, and in the black of that unnatural night, even the light of the stars seemed somehow dimmed. Beyond the fluttering curtains, I could barely make out the familiar shape of great pine trees, standing tall and poised like watchful sentinels in the night. There was hardly a sound on that summer night, nothing at all except for the rustling of curtains in the summer wind. Just then, the silence was broken. I heard the sound of something scraping against wood from outside the window, and I whipped my head around to look. Where moments before I had glimpsed only a wall of trees, I could now see a woman standing in the window. The woman grasped the open windowsill. Her long nails dug into the soft wood with a strength and pressure that showed in the expressed blue veins that throbbed against her skin. She wore a long, faded white gown that, to my horror, bore a massive, dried brown bloodstain across the middle of its ruined facade. The woman looked up at me through wild yellow eyes. Her face was a canvas for the purest of animal terror, and for a moment she simply stared at me. Then she let loose a terrible scream. The wail echoed through the darkened room with the force of hurricane winds. The curtains blew, and I felt paralyzing, deadly fear course through my veins. I felt my heart would burst and I would die if I had to listen to the awful wailing a minute longer. Then I felt a hand grab my shoulder. My eyes flew open, and I gasped for breath. I was back in the cab with my back against the door. We weren't moving, and by the sound I heard from outside, we had reached the airport. My driver was turned away from the wheel and had his hand on my shoulder, a look of concern written across his face. "Are you okay, man? We're at the airport." I tried to catch my breath. My heart was beating out of control, and I noticed that I was clutching my chest. I drew my hands back to my side and pushed away the driver. I collected myself and then spoke. "I'm fine, but I need to catch my flight." The driver gave me a disbelieving look, but he seemed to take me at my word. We left the car without another word. The driver helped me with my luggage and then got back in the car and drove away. The Newark airport was awash with noise. Airplane engines roared overhead through the hot night. The crowd of travelers, which spilled out the wide glass doors and into the drop-off lot, droned with distant conversation, but I heard none of it. My mind lingered on the dream. Despite what I had seen, I was not afraid. The fear seemed distant at the airport. I felt a peculiar safety amidst the crowd, and I was content to linger beneath the glare of artificial lights. My mind remained fixed on the dream, but my tired body moved forward. I had a flight to catch, and so I moved on, moving mechanically through the check-in and towards my terminal. I made my way through the lengthy process of checking in for my flight. But as I navigated the unending lines and the stalwart bureaucratic barriers of customs, my mind continued to wander. I realized why the experience in the cab had entranced me so. I had dreamt of the woman in white before. Her piercing scream was familiar. I had heard it many times before. I remembered the great trees bending in the force of the unnatural wind that came with the woman's presence. I remembered the room as well. I knew the blue dresser and the tiny chair. Indeed, I could never forget my childhood bedroom. There was something else, something the picture I was missing. My memories of those dreams were constant. The woman bloody and wretched, her screaming and the wild look in her eyes. They all remained fixed in my memory. But these memories, as brutal as they were, never ended with fear. There was something I was missing. At the edge of memory, in the fog of my unconscious mind, I knew there was more to this dream. I remembered waking up. I remembered crying, screaming for help. I was starting to recall there was always an answer to my pleading, a reassuring voice, a calming presence, the soft voice of my mother. The thought struck me with a terrible force. I had not thought of my mother in years, not since she had been sent away. I hadn't even spared the time to grieve when years earlier I had gotten the news of her death. I knew that there had been a good reason to forget the woman. These vague, half-recollected thoughts of her calming voice paled in comparison to the innumerable memories of manic screaming and hours of crying. I scowled through my mask. These recollections had reopened old wounds, and I was beginning to stew in the righteous anger of a wounded child. I would have gone on like that for hours uninterrupted, but I was abruptly returned to reality as my reminiscing was cut short by the listless commanding of a TSA agent. I had reached the front of the line, and as I took in the metal detectors before me, I forced my exhausted mind to contend with the here and now. It took nearly an hour to get through airport security, and by the time I had stepped into the terminal, boarding had already begun for my flight. As I joined with the line that had already begun to form, I absent-mindedly checked my phone. No new messages. This was not surprising, but still disappointing. I had reached out to all my old friends. I knew from Facebook a few of them had started families. Most of them had moved away, and it seemed that the remaining few wanted nothing to do with me. I tried to tell myself that this was fine. I had one thing to deal with, and one thing only: the house and all that came with it. The plane ride to Burlington from Newark was short, only an hour, but to me it felt like an eternity. Despite my exhaustion, I did not dare fall asleep. I did not want to return to that dream, not until I had to. Instead, I sat in my window seat, fighting a losing battle against sleep deprivation and resentment. Resentment against my friends for forgetting me. Resentment against my father for taking me from my home in the first place. But most of all, I resented myself for allowing the old man to do it. The various grievances began to morph and fold in on one another in the hot forge of my exhausted mind, until the reason and subject of my anger became obscured. I was left with only a deep unease and with a question. I needed to know what it was my mother had said to me all those years ago. As the plane began its descent and the vastness of the green mountain forests came into view beneath the cloud cover, the question seemed to grow a sense of urgency. The sun had just begun to rise when I joined the other passengers in leaving the plane. The Burlington airport was small, consisting of 2 modest terminals, and containing just one little cafe which had not yet opened. I left the terminal behind quickly, making my way purposefully toward the airport parking lot. Before I had left New York, I had made arrangements to lease a rental car for the few weeks I had intended to stay in Vermont as I handled my father's affairs. It didn't take long to find the car company's representative. After a few quick words with them behind the counter and the exchange of a few documents, I got the car and its keys and was back on the road. I had remembered the drive from the airport to my family home as beautiful. The natural beauty of Vermont, even this close to the state's only city, was unmatched in my view. To my adult eyes, however, I thought there was something deeply sinister about the thick forest that crowded in on both sides of the lonely strip of road. The mighty pine trees, which had once radiated such calm as they rose like steady watchers against the sky, now seemed to leer ominously down at me. The drive to the old house was not long, and in a matter of moments my destination rose up on the road ahead. I knew I was approaching my old home when the forest road turned sharply upwards. Soon enough, the rough concrete of the public road turned to fine cobblestone. The free mountain air that flew through the car's open windows seemed to turn impossibly stagnant and sickly as I watched the wild northern grasses fall to a well-manicured lawn and the rows of venerable pine trees surrender to manicured shrubbery. With one final turn in the winding road, my spirits fell, and by the feeling I knew that I was home. A great lawn spread out ahead of me, delicately manicured with bushes and flowers picked out by the family's serving gardener. The artificial landscape extended for yards in front of me, ending only at the very doorstep of my family home. The Decaux Manor had been built on the low, jutting cliffs that formed sporadically around this least of the Great Lakes. The old household did not stand on the cliffside. Instead, it crouched. The building was still and hunched, full of coiled tension, like an ancient toad ready to leap into the water below. I hated being home, but despite this, I felt a sense of relief. At last, my destination loomed up before me. My travels were over for now. I brought my car to a stop in the massive circular driveway that lay just beyond the doorstep and looked up into the darkened facade. As I closed the car door behind me and walked up the steps onto the familiar porch, I felt strangely at ease. Everything was exactly as I had left it years ago. The porch chairs sat clean and upright, unoccupied but not abandoned. I thought for a moment why my father had kept both the gardener and the housekeeper on payroll to care for a house no one lived in. I thought it might be time to let them go, but I pushed the thought away. Such a consideration was not one to take lightly, and I was far too tired to make a real decision about other people's livelihoods. Still, finding the house in such a familiar state was a pleasant surprise, one of the few pleasant surprises my father had provided me, even if it was posthumous. I cracked a smile at the thought, and with that, I produced the key to the front door. I had been given the keys to the family home by my father's longtime lawyer on the same day I had learned of the old man's death. In truth, I had been surprised that the bastard hadn't sold the house. I had said as much to the lawyer, but at that I had been reminded. This house had been in my family for generations. When I pushed the key into the lock and swung open the front door, I was immediately reminded of the manor's antiquity by what lay inside. I stepped into the old house's musty entryway. The walls were lined with paintings and portraits. I saw castles and landscapes painted in expert style, along with the countenances of long-dead Decots frozen forever in black and white. Beautiful carpets extended far into the long hallway decorated with complex arabesque patterns. As I walked further into the house, I came to the grand sitting room. The living room was massive, dominated by a grand fireplace and complete with great timber pillars extending to a domed ceiling like Roman columns. There was so much space, but the room was congested. Old and overly ornate sofas and chairs cluttered every corner. Ottomans blocked foot traffic in every direction, and countless curios sat on cluttered countertops. I didn't consider any of them. My father had taken great care to explain the significance of every one of the innumerable family artifacts kept in the house. I remembered lectures on the stories behind the old French language Bible my great-great-grandfather had bought centuries ago from Quebec, the Mayan pottery my great-uncle had recovered from a dig in Latin America, and many, many more. None of it had ever mattered to me. To me, it was all nothing more than priceless junk. There was only one keepsake in that museum of a living room that interested me. Above the mantel hung a portrait. It depicted a man of mediocre appearance. He had a head of thinning brown hair and a pudgy countenance and wore a suit typical of his 18th century setting. But it was his eyes that captivated me. They were shards of blue ice, cold and white blue like my own. To see them reflected in the painting, however, was a terrible thing. The man looked possessed entirely by hate, even in what was ostensibly a flattering portrait. I had always hated the painting. As a child, I had once asked my father who the man in the portrait was. My father had told me with pride that the man was my namesake, my great-great-great-grandfather, also named Adrian Decaux. To hear my father tell the story, our long-dead ancestor had come down from Quebec in the 19th century to take advantage of the trade in lumber and wool. The late Adrian Decaux had done so well that he had bought a plot of land from local sheep farmers and built our family home. I remembered my father had always seemed so proud when he told that story, but as I looked around the lifeless living room and considered my father's collection of useless keepsakes, I felt only disappointment. The house was full of history. Surely some of these artifacts were even valuable, but not to me. I sighed and turned away from the portrait's hateful gaze. I made my way to the back exit of the living room, but as I did, something caught my eye. Sitting on a small counter to the side of the back door was a long and ornate glass case. Within the case was an ancient-looking rifle, a bayonet's point fixed eternally to its barrel. There was something that I hated about the old rifle. I remembered asking my father what the gun was and why it was there. The old man had proudly told me it belonged to my great ancestor. According to my father, the weapon had been the older Adrian's hunting rifle, but as I stared into the polished steel bayonet, I knew the gun was not for hunting. A chill ran down my spine despite the summer heat, and I quickly left the living room behind, eager to stop thinking about the portrait and the old gun. Finally, I stopped at the door of my childhood bedroom. Pushing the door open, I was surprised to see it entirely the same. I hadn't stepped foot in this room for almost 7 years, and in that time, it seemed nothing at all had changed. The blue dresser, the little chair, even my bed, All of it was just as I had left it. I walked over to my bed, still made up in clean white sheets. I sat down. I remembered how afraid I had felt in this place. In the daylight, I had hidden here away from my parents' screaming arguments. But no matter how bad the days would get, the nights were always worse. I looked up at the window. I could see the pine trees standing tall and dark, and I saw the crystal waters of Lake Champlain sparkling in the noonday light. Under the zenith of an August sun, the view was picturesque, like a Norman Rockwell painting, but I saw none of this beauty. All I could think of was the woman from my dreams, pale and bloody beneath the blue moon. I tried to shake the memories from my tired mind. I turned away from the window and tried to tell myself that they were all just nightmares. I forced myself to focus on something else. I tried to recall what happened next. What would happen when I woke from these nightmares each night? Staring at the wooden floor, I tried to remember, and I thought of my mother. I would wake from my dreams, and there she would be, standing at my bedside, ready to reassure me. She would always ask me what was wrong, and I would tell her about the woman who would by now be gone from the window. Now, at last, sitting in the room where the words had been spoken, I remembered what my mother had said to me. She would hush me, stroke my hair, and wrap me in the tightest of hugs. Then she would say, "She was only screaming, sweet boy. Monsters don't need to be scary. Maybe she just needs help. Maybe she just needs you to know that she's there and to understand her." Now, as an adult, alone with the memories, it all seemed completely absurd. I wondered if my mother had believed those things she'd said about monsters in the end. I wondered if she believed that after her father had shut her out of the family. I wanted to know if she had still thought that understanding would solve everything after the real monster had made a weapon out of layers and psychiatrists and had locked her away. What did it matter anyway? Nothing my mother had ever told me held much weight anyway. She had been a dangerous lunatic. At least that was what my father had said, but he was dead now, and so was she. Only I remained alone in that house, just me and my memories. I stood up. I had decided that I would waste no more time on the past, and so I left my luggage where it lay. I exited my childhood bedroom and headed back out towards my car. It was the middle of the day, and I still had many things to do before the night would come and I would get my well-deserved rest. I drove back down the hill and into the city of Burlington. My father had left me a house, but one empty of food, and more importantly, alcohol. I would have need of both if I wanted to get through the 2 weeks I would have to spend in Vermont. The grocery and the liquor store were not far from each other, and in truth I didn't need to spend much time at either of them, but nevertheless, I lingered. I spent hours at both stores, meandering aimlessly in the aisles and staring without consideration at rows of bottles. I told myself that I was loitering around town in the hopes of seeing a familiar face, but I knew in my heart that this wasn't true. I didn't want to see my friends if indeed any of them remained. I just didn't want to go back home. When I finally did return to my car, my whiskey and groceries in tow, I fumbled with my keys and waited in the parking lot. When I drove back, I drove the speed limit and took every wrong turn I could find. By the time I finally came to the old cobblestone drive of the Decaux Manor, it was the evening, and the summer sun had begun to dip below the green mountains. I walked inside as quickly as I could. I walked the halls of my family home with a purpose, not sparing a moment's glance towards anything but my destination. I reached the kitchen quickly and set my bags down on the table. I liked the kitchen. It may have been the only place in the house I had warm feelings towards at all. The room had been a modern addition to the old house. It had a large window with a clear view of the lake and had been designed by my mother when she had married my father. This was the only place in the whole building bereft of history. No pictures hung on its walls, and no storied artifacts decorated its shelves. It was a world of stainless steel, marble countertops, and shimmering pots and pans. I took a pot down from the shelving, filled it with water, and set it to a boil. I sat down and watched the shadows of sunset cast themselves against the darkening waters of the lake. The nature surrounding the old manor was beautiful, and for the first time that day, I allowed myself to appreciate that. I watched the waves churn gently in the waters below, and I listened for the wind rustling softly in the pines. My mind began to wander with the wind, and images floated across my unconscious. I saw visions of a house on the lakeside. It was much smaller than mine, built in a crude and old-fashioned style, but it was unquestionably in the same spot that I now sat. I saw fences outside of it, and heard the bleating of sheep in the air. There was a woman with long dark hair and deep brown eyes. I watched her as she went about her life, tending to the animals, mending fences, and eating dinner alone in her shack by the lake. It was idyllic, a beautiful image, but it was soon shattered. An alarm rang out from my phone. The pasta was ready and my visions were ripped from me, gone as quickly as they had come. I ate my meal in silence. I watched the evening turn to night, but my mind was not on the view or my food. I thought only of the little house. It seemed so appropriate to me. The manor my family had built was too big for where it was. It blotted out the beauty of the horizon with its grossness and polluted the landscape with its ostentation. Standing in the midst of generations of overindulgence, I was enraptured by the vision of that woman, contented with her sheep and her shack by the lakeshore. By the time I finished my meal, the sun had disappeared completely. Alone on the cliff by the lake in an empty house, the only light for miles around was the overhead light above me. After years spent in New York City, the darkness outside the window seemed impenetrable. The rural night felt heavy all around me. I also felt the weight of my exhaustion. I hadn't slept in over 24 hours, and it was starting to show. I got up, finished my drink, and headed back to my childhood bedroom to get my luggage. I needed to find my toothbrush, brush my teeth, and sleep. Still, even as I walked, my mind wandered back to the little house, and it was not until I finally reached the old bedroom that something brought me back to reality. To my surprise, when I reached the old room, I found the door ajar, swaying in the wind. Looking further inside the darkened room, I saw more. The bedroom window had been opened. I felt cold fear run down my back. I knew I hadn't left this door open, and I certainly hadn't touched the window. I mustered up my courage and went into the room towards the open window. I pushed my head outside and looked around. There was nothing. I couldn't see anything but the trees, bending and groaning in the wind. I told myself that I must have left the window open. The room had been terribly musty, and I left it open to air out. I scanned the forest fence a second time and saw nothing. The explanations I gave were beginning to make sense, and I could feel my hammering heart begin to slow to a normal pace. I was ready to accept the story when I looked down at the windowsill. There in the soft pine wood, I saw dozens of long, deep scratches. Some of them seemed quite old, but others were alarmingly recent. Stray bits of wood and splintering indicated that as recently as last night, taloned hands had reached in through the window and grasped at the room within. At the sight of the ghastly markings on the sill, memories of my recurring childhood nightmares came flooding back. The woman in white, her bloody dress and baleful eyes. I had dreamed of her each and every night, watched her as she stared into the window, her nails digging into my windowsill. I had had the dream again. After 6 long years away, I had seen her again just as I was returning home. A single thought echoed through an empty mind. Had it all been real? The wind began to howl in the pines outside. As the gale screamed its fury out across the black expanse of Lake Champlain, I sat in horrified silence at the revelation. I stared for an unbroken minute at the deep gashes in the wood. Then the bare reality crashed upon me like a wave. It was real. What could it do to me? I answered the question in the only way that seemed sensible. I turned and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me and abandoning my luggage. The last living Decaux took off running down the long meandering halls of his family manor. I could hear the wind screaming on high as I ran. It didn't sound like wind anymore. I realized that it never had. The night air was alive with the sound of mournful, hateful, and all too terribly human wailing. The sound was so terrible, and with the sound of it, visions came. I saw a shape in the woods, the burning of torches, and finally flash and bite of a blade. I tried to shake the images from my mind and refocused on the light of the kitchen, which was now well in view. I ran faster as the light grew closer, and by the time I crossed the threshold into the white tile room, I was sprinting. It was then, as I saw my sanctuary fall in around me, that I felt my bare feet slip on the linoleum, and I began to go to the ground. I fell face forward and put my leg out in front of me. My knee collided with the tile, and white-hot pain shot through my leg as I crumpled into a limp heap on the floor. I was in a lot of pain, but I didn't stay on the ground. Instead, with a wince and an expletive, I forced myself back on my feet. The shrieking continued outside, and as I balanced myself against the counter, I saw that sheets of rain had begun to lash the glass of the window. There was a flash of lightning overhead, and for a moment the sprawling grounds of the Decaux Manor were entirely illuminated. There, through the driving rain and against the groaning pines, I saw a woman's silhouette amongst the trees. The glimpse was gone in an instant, and the forest was plunged back into darkness. I heard thunder boom in the night sky as I leaned against the marble countertop, reeling in pain. I refused to give myself a moment to recover. I knew I had to get out. As the wind wailed its lamentations on high, I grabbed my car keys off the counter and forced myself to limp forward. I struggled slowly and desperately through the dark house until, at last, I reached the great double doors and heaved them open. The doors flew open with the force of the storm, their handles forcing themselves free of my grasp. The vastness of grass and night loomed before me, obscured by the downpour. I swooned in the electric air of the storm, and my arm shot out for the wooden railings. Steadying myself, I looked out again. I realized everything looked different in the lively wet air. The effects of my wrecked knee and the whiskey I'd had with dinner began to meld with my exhaustion. I looked down at my keys and remembered that I hadn't slept in 2 days. I turned back towards the storm. The rain was cold and the wailing wind was bitter. Why was I so desperate anyway? Because I had seen scratches in the wood? I told myself that those could have been left by animals. I told myself that I was, by now, an urbanite and had no real idea what went on in the country at all. Why was I standing out here well past midnight, barefoot in a viscous thunderstorm? I was drunk, I was tired, and I was clearly seeing things. At least that's what I had decided to tell myself. Stabbing pain continued to lay siege to my exhausted mind, and I continued to rationalize. My eyes were heavy, and my vision was blurred. Even when lightning flashed again, and the looming figure of a woman again appeared in the forest fence, I ignored it. When the thunder crashed moments later, I let the crashing sound chase what I had seen from my mind. I looked at my car keys for the last time. They swam in my gaze. I knew that I was in no shape to drive. Lightning crashed again, but I did not turn to look. Nothing I saw would change anything. I turned around and limped back through the doors of my family home. I heard the door slam shut behind me and stared out into the darkness of my home. I had to sleep, and so I struggled dutifully back towards the kitchen. I found the bottle of whiskey where I had left it next to my half-eaten dinner. I took a swig to deal with the pain and then, with a wince, slammed the bottle back down on the counter. Then I stumbled towards the living room and collapsed upon one of the many overlarge settees. I ignored the wailing winds and shrieking pines and shut my eyes to the flashing lightning, allowing the wrath of the storm to rock me to sleep. When I finally slipped into a fitful sleep, I opened my eyes to the world of a tenebrous dream, and I saw once again the sight of a little shack standing on a cliff by the lakeside. I smelt wet earth and smoke in my nostrils. I heard the bleating of sheep and the crashing of waves on my rock. I looked forward and saw that I held a torch in an old, gnarled, and unfamiliar fist. In my other hand I held a rifle, the one I remembered from my living room. A bayonet was affixed to the gun, and it flashed in the torchlight. I steadied myself. I knew the object of my desires lay at the end of the dirt road ahead. I walked with a purpose up the unkempt and rambling path. When I finally reached the summit, I saw the despicable little shack hunched against the glorious horizon. I hated this place. I hated the woman who lived there as I had hated her husband. I had meant to build a house to fit my station on this spot. I fumed as I walked. I felt that I had a right to my anger. After all, I had made many generous offers for the land that these peasants were at present polluting with their wretched farm. The husband had flatly refused, telling me that this was his land and he wouldn't sell. Well, I had seen to that difficulty. The husband had disappeared on his weekly drive down to town for market. I flashed a toothy grin as I thought about my role in arranging the farmer's death. I had thought that this would solve my problem, but the woman had been uncooperative. I had noticed the wife on my first visit to the farmstead. She was young and very beautiful. I had wanted her from the first. When I had disposed of her husband, I had thought that I could take both the land and the woman, but she had refused me and spat in my face. I grimaced at the memory of humiliation, but gripped the butt of my rifle and grew giddy in anticipation of the satisfaction I knew was to come. I was almost out of breath when I reached the summit of the cliff. I saw the wild grasses of the savage's untamed land illuminated in the light of the blue moon extend before me in the night. The sheep began to bleat and scream as the sound of my heavy footfalls disturbed their rest. I thought of the mayor of Burlington. I thought of the sheriff and the bribes I had offered, and of the promises they had both given me. I was smiling now. No one could stop me now. I saw a flickering light through the cabin window. This was good. I wanted the woman alert for what was to come. I hurried forward towards the doorstep and pounded on the flimsy wooden door. After a minute of furious banging, I felt the door swing open and give way. In its place, I saw the woman appear, her black hair unkempt and flying in the summer wind, her wide eyes filled with a pleasing terror. I had meant to excoriate the impudent creature, to read her a list of every reason why this was happening, to punish her properly for her defiance, but I couldn't. I let my rage get the better of me, and before I could say a word, I was seized by a wild and oppressive fury. I thrust the point of my bayonet through the folds of her white nightgown and heard it pierce her soft midsection. I heard a sickly wet crunch as I pulled the blade free of my victim, and she fell to the floor. There was a moment of silence, and then the woman began to scream. She wailed and shrieked her defiance in a language that I could not understand. I didn't need to hear her words to know the woman's intentions. Even as she bled her lifeblood on the floor of her home, she shouted her opposition. Despite an increasing lack of air in her lungs, she howled her refusal. The sight enraged me. I had come demanding her rightful submission, but even at this painful end, the witch's forked tongue still dripped in rebellion and spat out only curses. It took only a flick of my wrist to silence her. I watched with satisfaction as my cold steel opened the woman's throat. Her wailing turned to gurgling, and her defiance was silenced as blood welled up in the canal I had left in her windpipe. I still burned with hatred as I watched the light die in her dark eyes. I heard thunder rumble over the lake as I turned to leave the shack. The pines groaned against the shrieking wind as a storm began to take shape in the east. I was fuming. The rain might wash the woman's blood from the ground, but I would not forget this. I would not let the witch rest peacefully. She would be punished for her defiance, if not in this life, then in the next. I made a vow to the shrieking wind. I swore that I would lay the foundations of my household over this woman's broken bones. I would build a monument to power, a mausoleum for my family and all who stood against them. The house that would be built over these ruins on the cliffside would command the skyline for generations to come. The thunder crashed, and the rain began to pour. I looked out over the wild grass and huddled sheep for another moment, and then, with a flash of lightning, I opened my eyes. The first thing I noticed was that I was in terrible pain. I swore as I sat up in the massive and uncomfortable settee I had fallen asleep in. I looked out across my darkened living room. I saw the grand fireplace directly in front of me. Atop the mantel, the portrait of my namesake, the first Adrian Decaux, stared back at his descendant through hateful, icy blue eyes. I turned away from the portrait with disgust. Something in its eyes brought back the memories of a most revolting dream. Looking for anything else to focus on, I turned my eyes away towards the window. It was dark outside, rain battered the window, and precious little sunlight made its way through the black storm clouds that hung heavy overhead. Distant thunder rumbled in the mountains, and lightning lit up the horizon. I shielded my eyes and looked down at my phone. I saw a severe thunderstorm warning displayed, and then I noticed that it was 1:30 in the afternoon. Finally, I saw that I had no cell phone service. With my misery compounded threefold, I groaned and cursed myself. The gardener was supposed to be here at 2, and I had left the house a mess. I pushed myself out of bed, and memories of the previous night began to come back to me piecemeal. I tried to push them aside, and when I saw the still open whiskey bottle on the kitchen counter, I found a worthy scapegoat for what I assured myself were hallucinations. I limped past the liquor and uneaten food and came to the landline. I picked it up, ready to call my father's old landscaper, when I heard, to my increasing dread, that the line was dead. The storm must have brought down the phone lines in the night. I swore again and tried to come up with any idea as to what to do next. I had an hour before the gardener was supposed to show up, but as I looked out at the raging storm, I was beginning to suspect that my guest would never arrive. This was an uncomfortable thought. After the night I'd had, I thought it would have been a great comfort to see another living person. I sat down in one of the kitchen chairs, relief flooding my lower body as I took my full weight off of my damaged knee. Despite the pain and enduring exhaustion, it only took a moment's time for a strange restlessness to set in, and I was back on my feet. I realized that I could not stand to look outside. I heard the wailing cries of the woman in every groaning pine tree, saw her twisted silhouette in every darkened corner, and felt her damning gaze wherever I sat for more than a moment. I spent the next hour pacing the halls of the Decaux Manor, chased from room after room by raucous thunder, and driven ever onward by the steady drumbeat of rain on the walls. I told myself that the previous night's events had been the understandable result of exhaustion and grief taking their full toll. Rationalizing further, I reaffirmed my earlier notion that the claw marks on the wood had been the work of some animal or another, and in my delirium I had overreacted. I told myself all of this, but somewhere within, I knew it wasn't true. I had not grieved for my father, and no matter how tired or drunk I had been, I knew that the things I had seen, the things that I had done in my dreams, were real. Somewhere deep in my subconscious I had made a decision. I knew that even if I were to try to run, I wouldn't get far. If by some miracle my leg was in no condition to run, and if the storm had knocked out the telephones, then there was no telling what shape the roads would be in. No, I could not run. But if I were to stave off debilitating panic, I knew I could not admit to myself that there was reason to fear at all. The last heir and namesake of Adrian Decaux would not be leaving the old manor that night. Once I had accepted this reality, I grew deaf to the wailing in the woods. I turned my eyes from the windows and ignored the crooked, bloody figure who, even in the light of day, now watched me from the woods. I continued my painful, manic, and yet constant pace through the halls of my family home. I passed the closed doors of opulent bedrooms and luxurious baths, but I opened no doors. I saw walls lined with paintings, tapestries, and photographs brought back to the house from all over the world by generations of now dead Decoes. I thought that I had been wrong to ever think of the manor as a home. This place, littered with the refuse of long extinguished lives, was a mausoleum and nothing more. I spent hours in this manor, pacing the halls and shutting out the world. I walked until the sun had set over the mountains, and I found myself again, standing in the living room beneath the hateful blue eyes of my namesake. It was a minute past midnight, and I stood alone, wounded and desperate, in the lightless expanse of my family home. I saw the relics of 4 generations spread out around me and looked up into the painted eyes of the man who had built for them their household. I wondered for a brief moment what I would bring back here. What testament would be left to tell of my life? What would my children bring back here? The wind continued to wail, and in desperation, I looked to the silent portrait of my ancestor for guidance. I knew what awaited me in the woods, and I understood that I could not escape it. The face of my ancestor, frozen in time, gave only one answer. The spirits of hatred and violence declared themselves brazenly in his ancient and eternal glare. I tried to take solace in the violence I saw all around me. It was through brutality that this land had been won, and if I were to escape, it was to be through these means that I had inherited. I turned away from the portrait, and there across the room I saw my deliverance. It lay in its glass case, glimmering and cruel as it had been left for centuries, my ancestor's rifle, bayonet still affixed. The screaming wind reached a fever pitch, and I began to feel as if my ears would burst under pressure. But against all of nature's wrath, I made my way toward the weapon. When I looked again upon the rifle, I saw the flames of long-gone years dance across the polished steel. I fumbled with the lock as I opened the case and nearly dropped the rifle from my shaking hands, but I steadied myself and stood tall against the raging storm and wailing wind. I walked towards the great double doors, gun in hand, with a confidence heretofore unknown to myself. When I stood in the darkened entryway, I readied myself for what I faced outside. Lightning flashed and lit up the room. I saw for a moment my own blue eyes reflected in the steel bayonet. I saw an alien hate in those shards of ice. I was animated, possessed, by a fury not my own. Something twisted inside of me, and I began to despise the thing in the woods. I was no longer afraid. Why should I be? I knew at that moment that I had killed this woman before, and I could do it again. With that faith in blood and steel, I shouldered my rifle, and for the first time in centuries, kicked down the doors of the house by the lake, ready for bloodshed. The vast grounds of the Decoe Manor spread out into the impenetrable blackness of midnight. The perfectly cut grass had been torn up by the storm, and well-manicured shrubbery twisted in the roiling wind. The perfectly still and tamed garden that had been built with meticulous care had been ruined and corrupted by one night of nature usurping the proper sovereignty of man. The civility I had brought to this land had been defiled, and there in the center of my land, on the circle of stone that my descendants had raised up, I saw the culprit standing alone and defiant. Her white nightgown bore the bloody marks of her first rebellion, and I flashed the vicious grin of my ancestors at the sight. I ran forward through the driving rain and towards my supposed antagonist, ignoring the shooting pain in my leg and with the point of my bayonet aimed forward. I moved toward my target with the precision of the lightning that arced above me. My feet sunk into the soft, wet earth, and the winds wailed as I drew nearer to the bloodied woman. The closer I came, the more I could see of the figure. I saw the dried blood caked across her midsection, the dirt caked behind her nails, and the gash across her neck. Through all the horrors, though, it was the look on the woman's face that finally stopped me in my tracks. I saw the world as it should have been in her dark eyes, set deep in a porcelain facade. I saw a little farm sitting on the cliff by the lake. I saw a couple living within, tending to herds of sheep throughout the long years. I saw then generations in a single moment. I saw the couple's children playing in the wild grasses, and amongst the sentinel pines, I saw their children's children continuing in the same fashion. Then the vision was snatched from me, and I saw only the specter, dead eyes lit only by sorrow for what would never be, cold purple lips mouthing a wordless scream in the face of this unbearable future. The spirit of spite and hatred within me marshaled a final attempt at control. The voice of heredity shrieked over the wailing wind. It told me that this was my land, my hard-won home, my birthright. I gripped the gun's barrel, but it only took one thought of that awful, cold home to shatter the spirit's charge. Years of neglect and abuse bore down on me with a force greater than the hurricane winds. I thought of the grand fireplace, cold and empty of a hearth fire for as long as I could remember. I remembered my parents, my father, callous and cold as any Decaux. I thought of my mother, cast out and dead before her time. I remembered her words to me. Monsters don't need to be scary. Maybe she just needs help. Maybe she just needs you to know that she's there and to understand her. I put my faith in that consolation and looked back into the pitiless black eyes of the woman in the night. I looked for compassion. I wanted to find leniency there and hoped for forgiveness, but I found none of that. There was only grief, anger, and despair in that specter. I thought of the house that lay behind me, that massive, cancerous outgrowth upon the land. I thought of what my family had taken from this woman, the generations that my ancestor had slaughtered on that one terrible night centuries ago. I allowed the rifle to fall from my hands, and I went to my knees. The shrieking winds and lashing rain no longer plagued me. Not even the ghastly apparition that stood mere feet in front of me seemed wrong anymore. How could there be anything else in a place like this? This house had been built on foundations of blood and bone, its wood hewn from strange trees, and its repugnancy imposed upon a land that did not want it. In such a place there was room for nothing but lamentation. Nothing good could grow here. I knew this now, not until the corruption had been rooted out completely. I was left alone again, my only companions the ghosts of the past, the wailing of the wind in the woods, and the work that was still to be done. Fire and steel had started this all, and by fire it would end. I would make sure of it. The storm raged until dawn, and when the sun's light found the Decaux Manor that morning, it found it a ruin. The fire had burned for hours, consuming timber and metal alike. Everyone for miles around the old house had seen the blaze, burning a red mar into the skyline despite the driving rain. But no emergency crew could hope to reach the place until well after the storm had receded and the many downed trees had been cleared from the country roads. The firemen and the EMTs found nothing. No fire to fight, no people to save. There were signs of me at the site. My rental car was later found abandoned in front of the airport entrance, but I myself was never seen in Vermont again. Almost nothing was left at all. The manor was gone, burned inexplicably to the ground. The devastation was almost total. The monstrous old house had been wiped from the cliffside. No wreckage stood testament to what had been done the previous night. There was only the stone foundation, sturdy and unrelenting in its hold on the earth. The house was gone, but what was started in the black of night would not be so easily finished. The blood would not be washed from the grasping rock so easily. After long centuries, the clearing on the cliff by the sea was left empty of that monument to domination. All that remained were the memories of long-forgotten sins. The scorching Australian sun beat down mercilessly as our family's rented SUV wound its way through the dusty roads of rural Victoria. I was 8 years old at the time, my face pressed against the window, watching in wide-eyed wonder as the landscape shifted from the familiar urban sprawl of Melbourne to the wild, untamed beauty of the Australian bush. My name is Thomas, And this journey was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime, a chance for our family to reconnect with our Australian roots and escape the mundane routine of our life back in England. Little did we know that this trip would become etched in our memories for reasons far more sinister than we could have ever imagined. Our destination was my great-aunt Matilda's farm, a sprawling property that had been in the family for generations. As we approached, the terrain became increasingly rugged. Fields of golden wheat gave way to dense eucalyptus forests, their pungent aroma filling the car each time we rolled down the windows for fresh air. Great-Aunt Matilda's farmhouse stood like a sentinel at the edge of a vast clearing, its weathered wooden exterior a testament to decades of withstanding the harsh Australian elements. As we pulled up, a cloud of red dust billowing behind us, I caught my first glimpse of the woman who would play a pivotal role in the events to come. Matilda was a striking figure, tall and lean, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. She greeted us with a warmth that belied her stern appearance, enveloping each of us in a tight hug that smelled of eucalyptus and something earthy and indefinable. "Welcome to the back of beyond," she said with a wry smile, ushering us into the house. "It's not much, but it's home." The inside of the farmhouse was a curious blend of old and new. Faded family photographs lined the walls, interspersed with Aboriginal artwork and modern appliances. It was as if the house itself was a physical representation of Australia's complex history, a juxtaposition of the ancient and the contemporary. As we settled in, Matilda regaled us with stories of the farm's history. She spoke of the indigenous Gunai people who had lived on this land for thousands of years before European settlement, of the hardships faced by the first farmers, and of the strange occurrences that had become part of local folklore. "This land has its secrets," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "There are things in these woods that defy explanation, but as long as you respect the land, it'll respect you back." I listened, enraptured, as Matilda spun tales of bunyips in the billabongs and min-min lights dancing on the horizon. My parents exchanged skeptical glances, clearly attributing Matilda's stories to an overactive imagination fueled by years of isolation. But there was something in the way she spoke, a gravity to her words, that sent a shiver down my spine. The next few days passed in a blur of new experiences. We helped Matilda with chores around the farm, marveling at the vastness of the property and the diverse wildlife that called it home. Kangaroos bounded across the fields at dusk, and kookaburras filled the air with their raucous laughter. It was on our fourth day at the farm that my mother, ever the avid bird watcher, suggested we take a walk in the nearby nature reserve. Matilda's expression darkened momentarily at the suggestion, but she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "Just be sure to stick to the marked trails," she cautioned, "and be back before dark. The bush can be unpredictable at night." Equipped with binoculars, water bottles, and a sense of adventure, we set off towards the reserve. The dirt track leading from the farm soon gave way to a narrow trail that wound its way through the dense eucalyptus forest. The canopy above was so thick that it seemed to swallow the sunlight, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. As we walked, my mother pointed out various bird species, her excitement growing with each new sighting. My father, less interested in the avian population, busied himself with taking photographs of the gnarled, twisted trunks of the ancient gum trees. I trailed behind, lost in my own world of imagination. In my mind's eye, the trees became sentient beings, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Every rustle in the underbrush was a mythical creature from Matilda's stories, watching us with unseen eyes. We had been walking for about an hour when we came across a small clearing. In the center stood a massive eucalyptus tree, its trunk easily wider than all of us combined could reach around. There was something odd about this tree. Its bark was darker than the others, almost black in places, and strange symbols had been carved into its surface. My mother approached the tree, running her hand over the carvings. "These look like Aboriginal symbols," she mused. "I wonder how old they are." As if in response to her touch, a flock of cockatoos suddenly erupted from the tree's canopy, their screeching calls shattering the forest's silence. We all jumped, startled by the sudden cacophony. It was then that we noticed them, two young men standing at the edge of the clearing watching us. They seemed to have materialized out of nowhere, their sudden appearance so silent and unexpected that it sent a jolt of fear through me. Both men were dressed in camouflage pants and dust-covered shirts. Their faces were streaked with what looked like mud or paint, giving them a feral, almost inhuman appearance. But it was their eyes that truly unnerved me. They were wide and unblinking, filled with an intensity that seemed to bore right through us. My father, ever the diplomat, raised a hand in greeting. "G'day," he called out, his attempt at an Australian accent falling comically flat. "Lovely day for a walk, isn't it?" The men didn't respond immediately. They exchanged a look that I couldn't interpret before the taller of the two stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice was oddly stilted, as if he was unused to conversation. "Where are you heading?" he asked, his eyes darting between us. My mother, sensing the strange tension in the air, answered cautiously. "We're not really sure. Just out for a bit of a wander, looking at the birds and such." The man's face twisted into what might have been an attempt at a smile, but it came across as more of a grimace. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said. "It's not safe." His companion nodded in agreement, speaking for the first time. "We know a great spot for sightseeing. Not far from here. Got some nice benches where you can rest, too." Every instinct in my body was screaming that something was very, very wrong. These men didn't move like normal people. There was a jerky, almost predatory quality to their movements, and their eyes never seemed to blink, giving them an unsettling reptilian appearance. My parents, however, seemed oblivious to the danger. Perhaps it was their inherent British politeness, or maybe they were simply unable to process the wrongness of the situation. Whatever the reason, they agreed to follow the men's suggestion. As we set off in the direction the men had indicated, I noticed that they positioned themselves on either side of our group, like sheepdogs herding their flock. The taller man took the lead, while his companion brought up the rear, his eyes constantly scanning the forest around us. The trail they led us down was barely visible, overgrown with ferns and vines that seemed to grab at our ankles as we passed. The forest seemed to grow denser, the trees pressing in closer, their branches intertwining overhead to block out what little sunlight had been filtering through. I don't know how long we walked. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the green twilight of the forest. But gradually, I became aware of a change in our surroundings. The natural sounds of the bush, the caroling of magpies, the rustle of wallabies in the underbrush had faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. Finally, we emerged into another clearing, but unlike the peaceful glade where we had first encountered the men, this one filled me with an immediate sense of dread. At the center of the clearing stood an old barn, its timbers gray with age and rot. The roof had partially collapsed, allowing glimpses of the darkening sky above. 3 large dogs were chained up outside the barn, Rottweilers, their muscular bodies taut with barely contained aggression. They snarled and barked as we approached, straining against their chains with such force that I feared they might break free at any moment. Next to the dogs, incongruous in its mundanity, was an old mattress. It was stained a dark brown and emitted a stench so foul that I could smell it from where we stood at the edge of the clearing. Flies buzzed around it in a thick cloud, their incessant drone adding to the nightmarish quality of the scene. My parents had finally seemed to realize that something was terribly wrong. My father pushed me behind him, while my mother gripped my hand so tightly it hurt. "I think we should be heading back now," my father said, his voice tense with barely contained fear. But before we could move, the barn door creaked open, and a figure emerged that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. He was impossibly tall, towering over even the two men who had led us here. He wore a blue pinstriped suit that might once have been elegant, but was now stained and tattered. Most bizarrely, perched atop his head was a large top hat, like something out of a Victorian novel. His face was a mask of contradictions. A wild, unkempt beard contrasted sharply with eyes that were unnaturally bright and alert. His skin was ruddy, almost sunburned, but with an unhealthy pallor underneath that spoke of too much time spent away from the sun. He approached us with long, loping strides, a wide grin splitting his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice surprisingly cultured and refined. "What have we here? Visitors? How delightful." I shrunk back, trying to make myself as small as possible behind my father. There was something fundamentally wrong about this man, something that went beyond his bizarre appearance. It was as if he was wearing a human shape that didn't quite fit, like a costume that was slightly too big. The man in the top hat turned his unsettling gaze to me, his grin widening even further. "And who might you be, young man?" he asked, bending down to my level. Before my parents could intervene, I found myself answering, my voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas," I said. "Thomas," he repeated, rolling the name around in his mouth as if tasting it. "A fine name. Tell me, Thomas, do you like dogs?" I nodded mutely, too terrified to speak again. The man clapped his hands together, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet clearing. "Splendid. Would you like to pet my dogs? They're very friendly, I assure you." The Rottweilers, as if on cue, renewed their frenzied barking, foam flecking from their jaws as they lunged against their chains. The juxtaposition between their obvious ferocity and the man's words was so absurd that I might have laughed if I wasn't paralyzed with fear. My father finally found his voice. "We really must be going," he said firmly, beginning to edge our family back towards the trail. But the man in the top hat was not so easily deterred. With a speed that seemed impossible for someone of his size, he darted forward and grabbed my arm. "Nonsense," he exclaimed. "You've only just arrived, and I so rarely have guests. Please come inside, I insist." What happened next is a blur in my memory, a chaotic jumble of images and sensations. I remember my mother screaming, a high, piercing sound that seemed to shatter the unnatural silence of the clearing. I remember my father lunging at the man in the top hat, his fist connecting with a sickening crunch. And then we were running, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the path. Branches whipped at our faces, thorns tore at our clothes, but we didn't slow down. Behind us, I could hear the baying of the Rottweilers and the enraged shouts of the men. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like lead. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, we burst out of the forest and onto a dirt road. An old pickup truck was approaching, driven by a weather-beaten man in a battered Akubra hat. My father flagged down the truck, his desperate gestures and our disheveled appearance clearly conveying the urgency of our situation. The driver, to his eternal credit, didn't ask questions. He simply opened the doors and told us to get in. As we sped away, I looked back through the rear window. At the edge of the forest stood the man in the top hat, watching us leave. Even from a distance, I could see the unnatural grin still plastered across his face. He raised a hand in a mocking wave, and then the truck rounded a bend, and he was gone. The driver, who introduced himself as Bruce, took us straight to the local police station. What followed was hours of questions, of trying to explain the inexplicable to increasingly skeptical officers. They searched the area we described but found no trace of the barn, the men, or the mysterious figure in the top hat. "The bush can play tricks on your mind," one officer said kindly but dismissively, "especially if you're not used to it. You probably just got turned around and panicked." But we knew what we had seen. The terror had been too real, the danger too palpable to be a mere trick of the mind. When we finally returned to Matilda's farm, shaken and exhausted, she took one look at our faces and knew. Without a word, she enveloped each of us in a fierce hug, then sat us down at the kitchen table and put the kettle on. As we sipped hot, sweet tea, Matilda finally spoke. "I should have warned you more clearly," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "This land, it has a way of drawing in the dark things, the twisted things that don't belong in the normal world. Most of the time they stay hidden, but sometimes, especially when the barriers between worlds are thin, they break through." She went on to tell us stories that had been passed down through generations of her family and the indigenous people before them. Stories of ancient, malevolent spirits that roamed the bush, of doorways to other realms hidden in the twisted trunks of gum trees, of creatures that wore human skins but were anything but human underneath. "The man you saw, the one in the top hat," Matilda said, her eyes distant. "He's been seen before. Always near that old barn, always with those dogs. Some say he's a ghost, the spirit of a cruel landlord who used to own these parts. Others say he's something much older, much darker." We left the farm the next day, cutting our vacation short. As we drove away, I looked back to see Matilda standing on the porch, her face etched with a sadness that seemed ancient and profound. The experience changed us all. My parents, once skeptical of anything they couldn't explain rationally, became more open to the idea that the world was stranger and more mysterious than they had ever imagined. They developed a keen interest in Australian folklore and indigenous spirituality, seeking to understand what had happened to us. As for me, I was never quite the same. The encounter awakened something in me, a sensitivity to the hidden currents that run beneath the surface of the everyday world. I began to notice things that others didn't, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, whispers in empty rooms, reflections that didn't quite match reality. Years passed and I grew up, but I never forgot the man in the top hat or the terrors of that day in the Australian bush. The memory would resurface in my nightmares, the grinning face looming out of the darkness, those unnaturally bright eyes gleaming with malevolent glee. When I was 18, I returned to Australia, drawn by an inexplicable need to confront my past. I found Matilda's farm abandoned, the house slowly being reclaimed by the bush. The locals told me she had passed away a few years after our visit, taking her stories and secrets with her. I hired a guide and ventured back into the forest where we had encountered the man in the top hat. We searched for days, combing through miles of dense bushland, but found no trace of the barn or the clearing. It was as if they had never existed. On our last day, as we were about to give up the search, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. There, carved into the trunk of a massive eucalyptus tree, was a symbol. The same strange marking I had seen on the tree in the clearing all those years ago. My guide didn't understand my sudden agitation. To him, it was just another scar on a tree in a forest full of them. But I knew better. This was a sign, a reminder that what we had experienced was real, and that somewhere in these woods the nightmare still lurked. As we made our way back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow that flickered at the edge of my vision, seemed to hold a menacing presence. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a tall figure in a top hat grinning at me from between the trees. Back in the nearby town, I delved deeper into local history and folklore. I spent hours in the small regional library poring over old newspapers and local history books. Gradually, a pattern began to emerge, a series of disappearances stretching back decades, always centered around the area where we had our encounter. The descriptions varied, but there were common threads: strange men leading people into the bush, an old barn that couldn't be found again, and always, always, the man in the top hat. Some accounts dated back to the early days of European settlement, describing a gentleman of unusual height and peculiar dress who would appear at the edge of newly established farms, luring children and lone travelers into the wilderness. One afternoon, as I was leaving the library, an elderly Aboriginal man approached me. He introduced himself as Uncle Jimmy and said he had noticed my interest in the local legends. "You've seen him, haven't you?" he asked, his rheumy eyes fixed on my face. "The tall man. The one who doesn't belong." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Uncle Jimmy sighed heavily. "He's been here since the dream time, that one. Not a man, not a spirit, but something in between. A trickster, a shapeshifter. We have stories about him passed down through countless generations." Over the next few weeks, Uncle Jimmy became my guide to a side of Australia I had never known existed. He taught me about the dream time, the Aboriginal understanding of the world's creation, and the spiritual forces that shape the land. He spoke of sacred sites hidden in the bush, of rituals to ward off evil spirits, and of the delicate balance between the physical world and the spiritual realm. "The world you see," he told me one evening as we sat by a campfire under a star-filled sky, "it's just the surface. Beneath it, around it, there are layers upon layers of reality. Most people go their whole lives never seeing beyond the surface, but once you've glimpsed what lies beyond, you can never go back to unknowing." As my time in Australia drew to a close, I felt both enlightened and burdened by the knowledge I had gained. The world seemed both larger and more dangerous than I had ever imagined. I knew now that there were forces at work beyond human understanding, entities that defied explanation lurking in the shadows of our reality. On my last night I had a dream, or perhaps it was more than a dream. I found myself back in the clearing with the old barn. The man in the top hat stood before me, his unnatural grin wider than ever. "Welcome back, Thomas," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the dreamscape. "I've been waiting for you. I wanted to run, to wake up, but I was rooted to the spot." The man leaned in close, his breath hot on my ear as he whispered, "Remember, curious little Thomas, some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. We'll be seeing each other again." I woke with a start, my heart pounding and sweat soaking my sheets. As I tried to calm my breathing, I noticed something on the bedside table that hadn't been there when I went to sleep. A small, battered top hat, miniature in size, like something from a doll or a toy. Shaken, I packed my bags and left Australia the next day. But as the plane took off, I knew in my heart that this wasn't the end. Whatever I had encountered in those woods, whatever force the man in the top hat represented, it wasn't confined to the Australian bush. It was something older, something that existed in the liminal spaces of the world, in the cracks between what we know and what we fear to know. Years have passed since that return trip to Australia. I've traveled the world, seeking out other encounters with the unexplained, other brushes with forces beyond our understanding. I've heard whispers of the man in the top hat in the misty highlands of Scotland, in the dense jungles of the Amazon, in the frozen wastes of Siberia. Always at the edges of civilization, always where the boundary between our world and the other is thinnest. Sometimes in my darker moments, I wonder if I'm being pursued, if that encounter in the Australian bush marked me somehow. Other times I think perhaps I'm the one doing the pursuing, drawn inexorably towards a truth I'm not sure I want to discover. But one thing is certain, that day in the eucalyptus forest changed the course of my life forever. It opened my eyes to a world beyond the one we see every day, a world of shadows and secrets, of ancient forces and timeless mysteries. And though it terrifies me, it also exhilarates me. For in a world where such things exist, anything is possible. As I write these words, sitting in my study surrounded by artifacts and books from my travels, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of something tall and dark outside my window, but when I turn to look, it's gone. And on my desk, serving as a paperweight for my notes, sits a small, battered top hat. a constant reminder that some stories never truly end, and that the line between reality and nightmare is far thinner than we'd like to believe. The man in the top hat is still out there, somewhere in the shadows of the world, and deep down, I know that one day our paths will cross again. Until then, I'll keep searching, keep questioning, and keep looking over my shoulder, always wary of what might be lurking just beyond the edge of sight. Fall of 1983. The air was crisp with autumn, and the streets of northern New Jersey were alive with that peculiar energy that only seems to exist on Halloween night. Looking back now, 40 years later, I can still feel the weight of that evening pressing against my memories, a darkness that changed how I viewed the world forever. I was 14 then, a freshman at Highland Regional High School, navigating the complex social dynamics of teenage life in suburban New Jersey. The early 1980s were a different time. No cell phones, no internet, just kids trying to find their place in the world through music, sports, and friendship. We thought we were invincible, untouchable. We had no idea how wrong we were. Our story centers around three boys, myself and my two friends, whom I'll call J and S to protect their privacy. We were an unlikely trio, bound together by freshman football and a growing obsession with heavy metal music. Jay was our unofficial leader, the kind of kid who seemed to have been born cool. He lived with minimal adult supervision in a chaotic household that none of us really understood. With his long hair, leather jacket, and perpetual cigarette, he was everything the rest of us wanted to be. S came from what you'd call a good family. Regular suburbanites with rules, expectations, and a Cape-style house that always smelled of fresh laundry and his mother's cooking. I fell somewhere in between, a mediocre student from a typical middle-class family, trying to figure out who I was supposed to be. That year, we discovered heavy metal, and it became our religion. Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, Ozzy Osbourne, Dio. We devoured it all, especially the darker elements that made our parents nervous. We'd spend hours in Jay's basement, playing albums backwards on his turntable, convinced we were hearing satanic messages in Stairway to Heaven. It seems almost quaint now, but back then it felt dangerous and exciting. Jay had fully embraced the metal aesthetic. In shop class, he'd crafted a crude metal cross, which he wore upside down on a leather cord around his neck. He'd started calling himself Johnny Blade after the Black Sabbath song, and the nickname had stuck among certain crowds at school. Looking back, I think he was playing a character, trying to find an identity that set him apart from the suffocating normalcy of suburban life. Halloween that year fell on a Monday. Coach Kelly had kept us late at football practice, running drills until the sun was setting. We were at that awkward age, too old for trick-or-treating, but too young to give up on free candy entirely. So we compromised, wearing our football jerseys as makeshift costumes while we hit up a few houses in S's neighborhood. The streets were filled with younger kids in store-bought costumes, their parents trailing behind with flashlights. Jack-o'-lanterns grinned from every porch, their candlelight casting dancing shadows on vinyl siding and manicured lawns. The air smelled of burning leaves and chocolate, and somewhere in the distance, someone was playing Monster Mash, loud enough for the bass to carry through the evening air. We ended up at S's house around 8, our pockets full of candy and our minds buzzing with the peculiar energy that seems to permeate Halloween night. For some reason I've never understood, we found ourselves in his parents' bedroom, the only time I would ever set foot in that room. It was a perfectly ordinary space. Matching bedroom set, flowered wallpaper, family photos on the dresser. A crucifix hung over the door, a testament to S's family's Catholic faith. The three of us sprawled across the queen-sized bed, sorting through our candy haul and trading pieces like currency brokers. The radio on the nightstand was off, the room lit by a single bedside lamp. Everything was normal, mundane even, until it wasn't. The radio clicked on by itself. At first, we laughed it off. Technical glitch, we told ourselves. But then the light started flickering, and something in the air changed. The temperature seemed to drop, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Jay's eyes lit up with a mixture of fear and excitement. He'd been waiting for something like this, I realized now. A chance to prove his devotion to the dark imagery he'd wrapped himself in. He pulled the crude metal cross from around his neck, holding it upside down. In retrospect, we should have stopped him. But we were 14, drunk on candy and heavy metal and the magic of Halloween night. We watched as he approached the clock radio, raising the cross like a weapon. I bless you in the name of... The words seem to echo in my memory, though I can't bring myself to repeat them even now. He moved to the lamp, repeating the same dark benediction. Then his eyes fell on the crucifix above the door. What happened next defies explanation. As Jay raised his makeshift cross toward the crucifix, the words barely forming on his lips, he was literally lifted off the ground. It wasn't like in the movies. There was no dramatic wind, no special effects. One moment he was standing there, and the next he was suspended 3 feet in the air, his eyes wide with genuine terror. Then, as if thrown by an invisible hand, he was hurled across the room onto the bed where S and I sat frozen in horror. I bolted into the hallway, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. Behind me, the radio was cycling through stations at impossible speed, the lights strobing like a nightmare disco. When I gathered the courage to look back into the room, I saw something that still haunts my dreams. Jay was convulsing on the bed, his eyes rolling back in his head, his tongue seeming to fold back into his throat. S reacted with remarkable presence of mind, pinning Jay down and forcing his fingers into his friend's mouth to prevent him from swallowing his tongue. I stood in the doorway, paralyzed between the instinct to help and the overwhelming urge to run. Jay was making horrible gagging sounds, his body rigid, while the lights and radio continued their supernatural dance. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The room fell silent except for our ragged breathing. Jay lay motionless on the bed, his eyes open but vacant. S was still holding him down, his own face pale with shock. When we tried to get Jay to speak, to explain what had happened, we discovered he couldn't make a sound. Whatever force had thrown him across the room had also stolen his voice. We fled to the front lawn, standing close together beneath the bedroom window like survivors of a shipwreck. From outside, we could still see the lights flickering, still hear the radio's possessed cycling through stations. S was panicking, torn between concern for his friend and fear of his parents' reaction to whatever was happening in their bedroom. Jay stood between us, trembling visibly in his leather jacket, unable to speak or even make eye contact. The cool kid, the self-proclaimed Johnny Blade, had been reduced to a frightened child. After about 10 minutes of standing in the cold October air, watching the supernatural light show through the window, S made the decision to call Jay's mother. I'll never forget watching Jay climb into his mother's station wagon. He looked small somehow, diminished. The streetlights caught his face as the car pulled away, and I saw something in his expression that I'd never seen before and never saw again. Pure, unadulterated fear. That night I lay in my bed crying, every creak of the house making me flinch. The glow-in-the-dark crucifix my grandmother had given me years before seemed to mock me from its place on the wall. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to find some rational explanation for what we'd witnessed. There wasn't one. The next morning I waited for Jay outside school. The October sun was bright, making the events of the previous night seem almost dreamlike. When Jay approached, I could see he didn't want to talk about it. His voice had returned, but something in him had changed. So I did what 14-year-old boys do. I made a joke about using his newfound supernatural powers to torch Coach Kelly's car. He laughed, and for a moment things felt almost normal again. But they weren't normal, and they never would be again. Jay was kicked off the football team a few weeks later for something trivial. Smoking behind the gym, I think. He drifted away from us after that, falling in with a different crowd. S and I remained friendly but gradually grew apart as high school progressed. We never sat down together to discuss what happened that night, never tried to make sense of it as adults. Over the years, S and I occasionally told the story to others, but most people dismissed it as a Halloween prank or teenage imagination. The fact that Jay had cultivated his Johnny Blade persona made the whole thing seem staged, though anyone who was there that night knows it wasn't. Eventually, I stopped telling the story except to those closest to me. Life moved on. We graduated, went to college, started careers and families. I've lived a largely normal life since then, unmarked by any other supernatural encounters. Sometimes I wonder if what we experienced was truly paranormal or something else, a manifestation of teenage angst and religious anxiety, perhaps, or a cosmic warning about playing with forces we didn't understand. I've tried to track down Jay and S over the years, curious about how they remember that night, but social media searches have turned up nothing. Perhaps they've changed their names, moved away, started fresh lives unmarked by the shadow of that Halloween night. Or maybe, like me, they've spent 40 years trying to make sense of what happened in that ordinary suburban bedroom. Last Halloween, my grandson asked me if I believed in ghosts. I thought about that night in 1983, about the invisible force that lifted Jay off the ground, about the terror in his eyes, about the way the radio and light seemed possessed by something beyond our understanding. I thought about how that experience shaped us, how it marked the end of our innocence in ways we couldn't articulate at 14. I didn't tell him about that night. Instead, I said something non-committal about keeping an open mind. But later, alone in my study, I found myself thinking about those three boys, about Jay with his upside-down cross and borrowed confidence, about S trying to save his friend while worried about his parents' reaction, about my own younger self, frozen in that doorway between childhood and something darker. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that bedroom in northern New Jersey. I wonder if other families have lived there since, if they've experienced anything strange. I wonder if that crucifix still hangs above the door, if the radio still sits on the nightstand. Most of all, I wonder about Jay. What he saw in those moments before he was thrown across the room, what took his voice away, and what he understood in that moment that the rest of us didn't. The early 1980s feel like another world now, a simpler time of Walkman and MTV, of untethered teenage freedom and unquestioning faith in our own immortality. But on that Halloween night, something reached through the veil between worlds and showed us how wrong we were. It showed us that there are forces beyond our understanding, that the barrier between the natural and supernatural is thinner than we imagine, and that sometimes the most frightening things aren't in the heavy metal songs we listen to, but in the ordinary spaces we think we know. I've never worn a cross since that night, upright or inverted. I've never played another record backwards or dabbled in anything occult. That one glimpse behind the curtain of reality was enough to last a lifetime. But every Halloween, when the air grows crisp and the leaves scatter across suburban lawns, I find myself remembering that night in 1983, when three ordinary boys encountered something extraordinary, and nothing was ever quite the same again. Some people say that time heals all wounds, that memories fade and sharp edges grow dull. But some experiences cut too deep to ever fully heal. They become part of who we are, changing the way we see the world and our place in it. That Halloween night in 1983 was such an experience for me. It taught me that there are things in this world that defy explanation, forces that don't care about our beliefs or disbeliefs, and that sometimes the most frightening truth is that we don't understand nearly as much as we think we do. My name is Mallow, and what I'm about to share isn't my story. It's my brother Keith's. He told it to me recently, after years of keeping the details mostly to himself. I'm writing it exactly as he told it to me, in his own words, because some stories need to be preserved in the voice of those who lived them. The events took place 7 years ago, when I was still living with my family in Ontario, Canada. Keith and his boyfriend Theo were both 20 at the time. Their relationship was still relatively new, marked by the intensity and uncertainty that often characterizes young love. They had just had their first serious fight, the kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew about a person. I remember finding Keith in the living room that day, scrolling mindlessly through his phone, trying to pretend he wasn't miserable. As his sister, I could see right through it. The house felt heavy with the weight of unspoken words and unsent messages. "Oh, come on, Keith," I urged him, sitting down beside him on our worn leather couch. "Just reach out to him. You know Theo loves the outdoors. Why not suggest a camping trip or something? Sometimes a change of scenery is all you need to get perspective." Keith resisted at first, but I could see the idea taking root. After some more gentle prodding, he finally agreed to make the call. I watched him head upstairs to his room, his shoulders tense with nervous energy. The next morning I deliberately made myself scarce, taking my car out early to give Keith space to prepare for the trip. He later told me about making breakfast that morning, how he stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the empty driveway where my car usually sat, trying to quiet the butterflies in his stomach. The way he described making eggs and toast on our mother's flower-patterned plates, every ordinary detail charged with anticipation. The drive to Theo's house was a study in anxiety. Keith found him sitting on the front steps, lost in whatever was playing through his headphones. There was an awkward moment when Keith had to honk the horn to get his attention. But then Theo looked up and smiled that bright smile that had first caught Keith's eye. And just like that, the tension began to melt away. The drive to Niagara took several hours, but they filled it with conversation, carefully at first, then with increasing openness as they worked through the issues that had driven them apart. Keith remembered how Theo's hand felt in his as they drove, warm and familiar and right. They arrived at the trailhead in the early afternoon. The sky was already threatening rain, dark clouds gathering overhead like spectators to what was about to unfold. They managed to get their tent set up in a clearing just as the storm broke, the rain coming down in sheets that drummed against the tent's fabric. Inside their shelter, Theo was laughing, rolling around on their sleeping bags like a kid. Keith watched him, struck by how young and alive he looked in that moment. That's when the conversation turned to the supernatural, a subject that had always fascinated Theo, but that Keith approached with skepticism. "Can I tell you something?" Keith asked, propping himself up on one elbow. "That weird deer creature you mentioned when we first got together, I think I shot it the other day." Theo's whole demeanor changed. "The Wendigo?" he asked, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Yeah, that thing," Keith replied, not recognizing the weight of the word he was casually throwing around. "The Wendigo." Theo's reaction was immediate and intense. "Don't say its name." But Keith, still operating in the realm of rational thought where ancient horrors were just stories, couldn't resist teasing him. "Why? Are you scared?" "Wendigo, Wendigo, Wendigo." "Shut up," Theo hissed, and there was real fear in his voice. Fear that Keith would soon understand all too well. They spent that night close together in their sleeping bags, the rain gradually tapering off to a gentle patter. Keith remembered how safe he felt in that moment, how foolish his earlier skepticism would soon prove to be. The morning brought with it a dense, unnatural fog. Keith left the tent to relieve himself, walking just far enough away for privacy. That's when everything began to change. The fog seemed to thicken around him, taking on an almost solid quality. When he tried to return to the tent, he found himself disorientated, the familiar landmarks of their campsite swallowed by the white void. Then he heard Theo's voice, or what sounded like Theo's voice, calling his name. "Keith?" "I'm over here," he called back. But something felt wrong. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing in impossible ways. "Come on, Keith." That's when he remembered Theo's warning about the creature they'd discussed the night before, how it could perfectly mimic the voices of those you loved, using them to lure you to your doom. The realization sent ice through his veins. What happened next still gives Keith nightmares. He backed away from the voice, only to collide with something solid, something that breathed hot, rancid breath on his neck. Keith, at 6'4", was used to being the tallest person in any room. The fact that something could tower over him was terrifying in itself. When he turned around, he came face to face with a nightmare. It looked like a deer, but wrong in every conceivable way. It stood upright on legs that bent backwards, its body a patchwork of rotting flesh and exposed bone. Its teeth, yellow and sharp and far too numerous, were bared in what could only be described as a smile. The creature dropped to all fours and began to stalk toward him, its claws leaving deep gouges in the earth. The smell of decay rolled off it in waves, so strong it made Keith's eyes water. He ran, purely on instinct, his body moving before his mind could fully process what he was seeing. By some miracle, he burst out of the fog bank and found their tent. Theo was there, looking worried, and for a moment everything felt normal again. But Keith knew they had to leave. Now. They packed up their camp in record time, leaving half their gear behind in their haste. As they hiked back toward the car, Keith kept catching glimpses of movement in the trees. A flash of pale flesh, the glint of yellow teeth, gone when he tried to focus on it. "Did you see it?" Theo asked, his voice tight with fear. Keith nodded, unable to look away from the trees. Theo squeezed his hand and kissed his cheek, a gesture of comfort that was immediately undermined by what happened next. "Hey, Keith," came Theo's voice, but Theo's lips hadn't moved. "Yeah?" Keith responded automatically, turning to look at his boyfriend. Theo's face had gone chalk white. "That wasn't me," he whispered. They abandoned their backpacks and began to walk faster, taking turns watching the forest and the trail ahead. The woods had fallen completely silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of their own footsteps. When they stopped to rest, perching on a fallen log, they made the mistake of looking back. The creature was there, about 10 yards behind them, its impossibly long tongue dragging along the ground as if tasting their trail. They ran. There was no other choice. "Why did you have to say its name?" Theo screamed as they fled. "I didn't think it was real." Keith gasped back, his lungs burning. The smell hit them first, a overwhelming stench of decay that made them gag and stumble. Theo fell and Keith's heart nearly stopped. He ran back to help him up, but those precious seconds cost them dearly. The creature caught Keith by his shirt, throwing him to the ground with inhuman strength. It pressed down on his chest, and Keith felt his ribs beginning to crack under the pressure. The pain was beyond anything he'd ever experienced. Theo saved his life then, smashing a branch across the creature's head. It released Keith with a shriek that would haunt both their dreams for years to come. They ran again, running until they burst out of the forest and collapsed on the ground. Theo, operating on pure adrenaline, actually laughed and shouted a defiant, "Suck it!" into the forest. But Keith couldn't share in the triumph. He could feel something very wrong in his chest, and darkness was creeping in at the edges of his vision. The last thing he remembered was Theo's face above him, streaked with tears, begging him to stay awake. Keith woke up in the hospital 3 days later. 17 broken ribs, the doctor said, an injury pattern they couldn't quite explain. Theo was there, holding his hand, his eyes red from crying and lack of sleep. That was 7 years ago. Keith and Theo are married now, living in a city where the forests feel safely distant. They've built a life together, marked by love and laughter, and the kind of deep understanding that can only come from facing something impossible together. But they never camp anymore. They don't hike in remote areas, and they absolutely never say that creature's name. Sometimes on foggy mornings, Keith catches Theo staring out the window with a distant look in his eyes. On those days, they hold each other a little closer, grateful for the solid walls around them and the busy streets below. Keith still has breathing problems from his injuries, and sometimes he wakes up in the night, convinced he can smell decay on the wind. Theo is always there to hold him, to remind him they're safe, to help him distinguish between memory and reality. When Keith finished telling me this story, I asked him if he ever regretted that camping trip. He thought about it for a long moment before answering. "That thing nearly killed me," he said finally. "But that day also showed me something important. It showed me that Theo would literally fight a monster for me." How many people can say they've had that kind of proof of love? They keep the curtains closed on foggy days now, and they've developed a habit of checking that all their doors and windows are locked before bed. Some might call it paranoia, but they know better. They know that sometimes the old stories are true, that sometimes the monsters are real, and that love, while powerful, isn't always enough to keep them at bay. But they also know that they survived, that they found each other again in that forest, and that whatever else might lurk in the dark places of the world, they'll face it together. I sometimes wonder if the creature is still out there, stalking the forests around Niagara, waiting for someone else to speak its name. But like my brother and his husband, I've learned not to say certain words out loud. Some names, once spoken, can never be taken back, and some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. My name is Sherry, and I'm a professional urban explorer. I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but recent events have compelled me to warn others about the dangers lurking in abandoned places. It all started during my spring break from Colorado State University, where I'm working on my business degree. I've always been drawn to the thrill of exploring forgotten places. There's something exhilarating about stepping into a world frozen in time, untouched by the modern world. I remember the first time I snuck into an abandoned factory when I was 15. The rush of adrenaline, the eerie silence broken only by my footsteps, the sense of discovery. I was hooked from that moment on. Over the years, I've honed my skills and built up quite a reputation in the urban exploration community. I'm known for taking on challenges that others shy away from, for pushing the boundaries of what's considered safe or sane. It's not just about the thrill, though. There's a beauty in decay, a story in every abandoned building that's waiting to be told. And I've always seen myself as a sort of unofficial historian, documenting these forgotten places before they're lost to time or demolished. My latest target was the old Carnival Hotel in Bivouac, Colorado, a relic from the 1980s when Japanese corporations were trying to create a Las Vegas of Colorado. I first heard about it on one of the urban exploration forums I frequent. Someone had posted a few tantalizing photos, a partially constructed roller coaster on the roof, carnival games in the lobby, and most intriguingly, the entrance to a house of mirrors that no one had fully explored. I spent weeks researching the place. The hotel was part of an abandoned project to build a gambling city along the interstate. A Japanese company called Kiken Industries. I later found out Kiken means danger in Japanese, should have been a warning sign, had bought up land and started construction. They had big plans: casinos, hotels, entertainment venues. The Carnival Hotel was supposed to be their crown jewel, but the project ran into trouble. There were rumors of corruption, of bribes to state officials to change gambling laws. The local community pushed back hard against the idea of turning their quiet corner of Colorado into a mini Las Vegas. And then there were financial issues. The Japanese economy was starting to wobble, and funding dried up. In the end, only the Carnival Hotel was completed, and even that never officially opened. There were stories of a few test runs, of high-rolling guests brought in to try out the facilities, but nothing concrete. The whole project was abandoned, leaving behind a ghost town before the town was even built. As I dug deeper into the history, I found myself becoming obsessed. There was something about this place that called to me. Maybe it was the contrast between the intended glamour and the reality of abandonment. Or perhaps it was the mystery of the unfinished project, the stories left untold. Whatever it was, I knew I had to explore it myself. I planned my expedition meticulously. I always do. Urban exploration might seem like just breaking into old buildings. But there's a lot more to it if you want to do it right and, more importantly, safely. I studied satellite images of the area, looking for the best approach that wouldn't attract attention. I read through building codes from the 1980s, trying to get a sense of the hotel's layout and potential hazards. I also reached out to my network of fellow explorers. A guy I knew, Danny, had been there before. He was planning to set up a geocache in the hotel, a kind of treasure hunt popular among outdoor enthusiasts. I didn't usually mix geocaching with my urban exploration, but Danny's insights into the building's layout were invaluable. As the day of my expedition approached, I found myself getting more and more excited. I packed and repacked my gear, making sure I had everything I might need. Flashlights with extra batteries, a first aid kit, gloves, a dust mask, my camera, a portable charger for my phone. I even packed a small drone. I had this idea of getting some aerial shots of the hotel and the surrounding area. The night before I left, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, imagining what I might find in the Carnival Hotel. Would there be remnants of the casino that never was? Would the carnival games in the lobby still work? And what about that house of mirrors that no one had fully explored? Little did I know that my wildest imaginings couldn't come close to the reality of what I would encounter. I set out early in the morning, my beat-up Subaru Justy loaded with camping gear, always good to have a cover story, and my urban exploration kit. The drive was long, taking me through some of the most beautiful parts of Colorado. As I drove, I found myself thinking about why I do this. It's not just about the thrill, although that's certainly part of it. There's something about these abandoned places that speaks to me. They're like time capsules, preserving moments of the past that would otherwise be lost. And in a world that's constantly changing, constantly moving forward, there's something comforting about these static, unchanging places. I arrived at the campground nearest to bivouac in the early afternoon. I set up my tent and made a show of settling in, chatting with the park ranger about my plans to do some hiking over the next few days. Always establish your alibi. That's another rule of urban exploration. As night fell, I found myself getting antsy. I wanted to start my exploration right away, but I forced myself to wait. Patience is crucial in this game. Instead, I sat by my campfire, looking over my maps and plans one last time. I also checked the Urban Exploration Forum on my phone. There was a new post from Danny. He'd successfully placed his geocache in the hotel. He didn't give away the location, of course, but he did mention that it was in a reflective place. I smiled to myself, pretty sure I knew where he'd hidden it. I managed to get a few hours of sleep before my alarm went off at 1 a.m. I packed up quickly and quietly, leaving my tent set up to maintain the illusion that I was still there. Then I hit the road, driving the last few miles to bivouac. The storm hit just as I was taking the exit off the interstate. At first, it was just a few flashes of lightning in the distance, but by the time I reached the outskirts of what would have been bivouac, the rain was coming down in sheets. I could barely see the road in front of me. I almost turned back. The smart thing would have been to wait out the storm, but I was too keyed up, too excited to delay any longer. Plus, there was a part of me that thought the storm would only add to the atmosphere. How many people get to explore an abandoned carnival-themed hotel in the middle of a thunderstorm? I found the access road to the hotel easily enough. It was overgrown, barely more than a trail at this point, but my trusty Justy handled it like a champ. As I rounded the final bend, The hotel came into view, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Even in the darkness and rain, the Carnival Hotel was an impressive sight. It loomed against the stormy sky, a hulking silhouette occasionally illuminated by flashes of lightning. The partially constructed roller coaster on the roof looked like some kind of monstrous growth, its skeletal tracks reaching up into the clouds. I parked my car behind the hotel, out of sight of the main road. As I sat there, rain drumming on the roof, I felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This was it. After weeks of planning and anticipation, I was finally here. I took a deep breath, double-checked my gear, and stepped out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet, and I was soaked through in seconds. I made a dash for the nearest entrance, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I ran. The door was locked, but that's rarely a problem for an experienced urban explorer. I had my lock-picking set out and was working on the lock when a particularly loud crack of thunder made me jump. For a moment I could have sworn I saw a face in one of the upper windows, a pale, mask-like visage staring down at me. But when I looked again, it was gone. Just my imagination, I told myself. Nerves and bad weather playing tricks on me. The lock finally gave way, and I slipped inside, closing the door behind me. The silence inside was almost shocking after the roar of the storm. I stood there for a moment, water dripping from my rain gear, listening. But there was nothing, no creaks, no groans, just the muffled sound of rain and thunder from outside. I switched on my main flashlight, and the beam cut through the darkness, revealing the hotel's main lobby. And what a sight it was. Despite years of abandonment, you could still see the carnival theme clearly. The check-in desk was designed to look like a ticket booth, complete with a faded awning. The floor was a faded but still visible pattern of red and white stripes, like a circus tent. But it was the game stalls that really caught my attention. They lined the walls, their colorful facades somehow preserving a hint of their former glory. I walked up to the nearest one, a ring toss game. To my surprise, the metal grid was still intact, and there was even a container of rings sitting on the counter. I couldn't resist. I picked up a ring and tossed it. It clattered against the metal grid and fell to the floor. I tried again, and this time the ring caught on one of the posts. I let out a quiet cheer, feeling a childish sense of accomplishment. As I moved from stall to stall trying out the games, I almost forgot why I was there. For a few minutes, I wasn't an urban explorer in an abandoned hotel. I was a kid at a carnival, without a care in the world. It was only when my flashlight beam fell on a tattered poster advertising the hotel's grand opening, a grand opening that never happened, that I was snapped back to reality. I shook myself out of my reverie. I had work to do. I needed to set up my base camp, document everything I could, and then tackle the real challenge, the house of mirrors that no one had fully explored. I chose a spot behind the check-in desk to set up my base camp. It was out of sight of the entrance and would give me a good vantage point of the lobby. I laid out my gear, extra batteries, first aid kit, water, energy bars. I also left a sealed envelope with my identification and an explanation of what I was doing there. It's a precaution I always take, just in case something goes wrong and someone else finds my stuff. With my base camp set up, I started my systematic exploration of the hotel. I always work from the ground up. It's safer that way, and it gives you a good sense of the building's layout before you tackle the upper floors. The ground floor was a treasure trove for an urban explorer. Beyond the lobby there was a restaurant with an open kitchen. Most of the equipment had been removed, but there was still a massive pizza oven built to look like a clown's gaping mouth. It was simultaneously fascinating and unsettling. There was also a small arcade, though most of the machines had been removed. A few remained, their screens dark and silent. I made a mental note to come back and see if any of them still worked. You'd be surprised how durable some of those old arcade machines can be. As I moved through the hotel, I documented everything meticulously. I took photos, made notes on my phone, even recorded some video. This wasn't just for my own records. I planned to share my findings with the urban exploration community. It's an unwritten rule among us. You explore, you document, you share. It's how we preserve these places, at least digitally, before they're lost forever. The upper floors were mostly guest rooms, and as I'd expected, they were largely empty. Most of the furniture had been removed, leaving behind only the built-in fixtures. But even these were interesting. The rooms had been designed to continue the carnival theme, with bed frames shaped like carousel horses and wallpaper patterned with circus tents and Ferris wheels. As I explored, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It's a common sensation in abandoned buildings. Your mind plays tricks on you, interpreting every shadow as a potential threat. But this felt different, more intense. Several times I spun around, sure that I'd heard footsteps behind me, only to find empty hallways. I tried to rationalize it. The storm was still raging outside. What I was hearing was probably just the wind, or rain finding its way inside through some unseen opening. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger as I made my way up through the hotel. It was on the 10th floor that I found something truly strange. One of the rooms was locked, the first locked door I'd encountered since entering the hotel. My curiosity piqued. I set to work on the lock. It was more complex than the one on the entrance, and it took me several minutes to open it. When I finally got the door open, I was hit by a wall of stale air. The room beyond was pitch black, my flashlight beam seeming to be swallowed up by the darkness. As I stepped inside, I realized why. The walls, ceiling, and even the floor were covered in some kind of dark, matte material. It took me a moment to realize what I was looking at. It was a camera obscura room. The hotel must have been planning to offer some kind of pinhole camera experience to its guests. There was a small hole in one wall, currently covered by a metal plate. I approached it, my heart racing with excitement. This was the kind of unique find that urban explorers live for. I slid open the plate and gasped. The storm outside had passed, and moonlight was streaming in through the tiny opening. On the opposite wall, I could see a perfect inverted image of the outside world. The empty parking lot, the overgrown landscaping, even the distant highway. I stood there for I don't know how long, mesmerized by the silent, upside-down world projected on the wall. It was beautiful and eerie at the same time, a ghost of the view that hotel guests would have seen if the carnival had ever opened. As I watched, I saw something move in the image. At first, I thought it was just a tree branch swaying in the wind, but then I realized it was a figure walking across the parking lot towards the hotel. My heart started pounding. Had someone followed me here? Was it security? Or worse, another explorer encroaching on my territory? I quickly closed the plate and left the room, locking the door behind me. I needed to get back to my base camp and regroup. As I made my way back down through the hotel, I kept an ear out for any sounds of an intruder, but the hotel remained silent. Back in the lobby, I did a quick check of my supplies and tried to calm myself down. I was probably just seeing things. The camera obscura room had messed with my perception, that's all. And even if someone else was here, so what? I hadn't done anything wrong. Well, nothing more wrong than trespassing. And the hotel was big enough for more than one explorer. Still, I decided to be cautious. I would continue with my exploration, but I'd be extra alert for any signs of another person. And I'd save the House of Mirrors, my main objective, for last. If there was someone else here, they'd probably explore the upper floors first, giving me time to check out the mirrors and get out. With that plan in mind, I gathered my gear and headed for the basement. In my experience, hotel basements can be gold mines for urban explorers. They're often where you find the really interesting stuff: old records, forgotten equipment, sometimes even safes or vaults that were too heavy to move when the building was abandoned. The stairs to the basement were behind a door marked "Employees Only." The door wasn't locked, but it opened with a loud creak that echoed through the empty lobby. I winced at the noise. So much for stealth. The basement was pitch black, the beam of my flashlight seeming to be swallowed up by the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, a steady plink, plink, plink that set my nerves on edge. I made my way carefully through the basement, my flashlight beam sweeping back and forth. There were old boilers, massive laundry machines, and shelves upon shelves of cleaning supplies and hotel amenities. But what really caught my attention was a door at the far end of the basement, half hidden behind a stack of moldy mattresses. The door was locked, but it was an old lock, and I made quick work of it. Beyond was a small room that must have served as an office. There was a desk, a filing cabinet, and shelves lined with binders and folders. My heart raced as I approached the desk. This was exactly the kind of thing I was hoping to find. Records that could tell me more about the hotel's history, maybe even explain why it was abandoned. I started going through the drawers, carefully examining each document I found. Most of it was mundane stuff: invoices, employee records, maintenance logs. But then I found something interesting: a folder marked Project Carnival. Inside were blueprints for the hotel, including areas that had never been built. There were plans for an indoor water park, a full-sized Ferris wheel, even an aquarium. It was ambitious, to say the least. But what really caught my attention was a series of memos discussing the House of Mirrors. According to the memos, the mirrors had been specially commissioned from a company in Japan. They were described as unique and one of a kind, with vague references to some kind of special properties. One memo in particular stood out. It was from the project manager to the CEO of Keegan Industries, dated just a few weeks before the project was abandoned. It read, "We've encountered some unusual phenomena with the mirrors. Several workers have reported disorientation, hallucinations, and in 2 cases, brief disappearances while working in the House of Mirrors. Our on-site psychologist suggests mass hysteria, but I'm not convinced. I recommend we halt further work on this attraction until we can conduct a full investigation." The memo sent a chill down my spine. What kind of mirrors could cause people to disappear, even briefly? I told myself it was probably just superstition, or maybe a trick of the light in the mirrored maze. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. I pocketed the memo, along with a few other interesting documents, and made my way back up to the lobby. By now, several hours had passed since I'd entered the hotel. The storm had died down, and pale morning light was starting to filter through the boarded-up windows. I decided to take a break, eat some of the energy bars I'd brought, and review my findings so far. As I sat behind the check-in desk, munching on a granola bar, I couldn't stop thinking about the House of Mirrors. The memo I'd found had only intensified my curiosity. What was waiting for me in there? After my break, I decided it was time to tackle the main attraction. The entrance to the House of Mirrors was off the main lobby, behind a set of double doors decorated with painted jesters and clowns. The paint was faded and peeling, but you could still make out the leering faces. I stood in front of the doors for a moment, steeling myself. I'm not usually one for hesitation. I've explored plenty of creepy places before. But something about this felt different. Maybe it was the memo I'd found. Or maybe it was just the culmination of all the strange feelings I'd had since entering the hotel. Whatever it was, I had to force myself to push open those doors. The entrance hall to the House of Mirrors was dark and silent. My flashlight beam revealed walls lined with mirrors, some cracked, others clouded with age, but many still perfectly intact. At the end of the hall was another set of doors, these ones made of a dark polished wood. I approached cautiously, my reflection multiplying around me. As I got closer to the inner doors, I noticed something odd. In some of the mirrors, my reflection seemed off. Delayed, maybe, or moving slightly differently than I was. I told myself it was just an optical illusion, a trick of the light and the angles of the mirrors. The inner doors were locked, but the lock was simple. As I worked on picking it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something standing behind me, but there was never anything there, just my own reflection staring back at me. Finally, the lock clicked open. I took a deep breath, switched my flashlight to its highest setting, and pushed open the doors. The House of Mirrors was vast, much larger than I had expected. The ceiling was high, lost in darkness above the reach of my flashlight. Mirrors of all shapes and sizes lined the walls, creating an infinite regression of reflections. The floor was a checkerboard of black and white tiles, adding to the disorienting effect. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The air was thick and stale, with an odd metallic tang that I couldn't quite place. As I moved deeper into the maze, the mirrors seemed to shift and change, distorting my reflection in increasingly bizarre ways. I tried to maintain my sense of direction, but it was nearly impossible. Every turn led to another identical corridor of mirrors. I started to leave marks on the floor with a piece of chalk, but even that didn't seem to help. I would turn a corner and find myself in an area I was sure I hadn't been before, with no chalk marks in sight. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that place. I couldn't tell if I'd been in there for minutes or hours. My watch had stopped working, and when I checked my phone, the screen was nothing but static. As I wandered deeper into the maze, I started to notice things in the mirrors that shouldn't be there. Shadows moving when I was standing still. Reflections that didn't quite match my movements. And sometimes, just at the edge of my vision, I thought I saw a figure. Tall, wrapped in dark robes, face hidden behind a mask. I told myself it was just my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me in this disorienting environment. But with each passing moment, each new glimpse of that mysterious figure, my certainty wavered. And then I saw him clearly for the first time. I had turned a corner, and there he was, standing at the end of the corridor. He was impossibly tall, his head nearly touching the high ceiling. He wore a dark gray kimono, tattered and stained, but it was his face that froze me in place. A white porcelain mask, painted with a spiral of black that seemed to move and shift as I stared at it. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. When I looked again, he was gone. But now I could hear something, a soft, rhythmic sound, like breathing, and it was getting closer. Panic set in. I ran, no longer caring about maintaining my sense of direction. I just wanted out. But no matter how far or fast I ran, the breathing seemed to follow me. Sometimes it was behind me, sometimes ahead. Once, terrifyingly, it seemed to be coming from all around me. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs were burning, my legs aching. And then, miraculously, I saw it. The exit. The same dark wooden doors I had entered through. I sprinted towards them, relief flooding through me. But as I reached for the handle, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror beside the door. The masked figure was right behind me, one long-fingered hand reaching for my shoulder. I screamed and threw myself at the doors. They burst open and I tumbled out into the entrance hall. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I was back in the lobby. I stood there, gasping for breath, my whole body shaking. Had that really happened? Or had I just panicked in the disorienting environment of the House of Mirrors? As my breathing slowed and my heart rate returned to normal, I tried to rationalize what I had experienced. It must have been a hallucination, I told myself. The result of sensory deprivation in that mirrored maze, combined with the suggestive power of that memo I had read. But a part of me knew that wasn't true. What I had seen, what I had felt in that place, it was real. And I knew I needed to leave immediately. I gathered my gear as quickly as I could, not even bothering to properly pack everything. As I was about to leave, I remembered the white lion plush I had won from one of the carnival games. It was still clipped to my backpack, its glassy eyes staring at me. On an impulse, I unclipped it and left it on the check-in desk. It felt wrong to take it with me, like it belonged here, in this place of forgotten dreams and hidden nightmares. I ran to my car, threw my gear in the back, and peeled out of the parking lot. As I drove away, I couldn't help but look in my rearview mirror. The Carnival Hotel stood silently behind me, its windows dark and empty. But for a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in one of the upper windows. Tall, robed, masked. I didn't stop driving until I was back in familiar territory, the sun high in the sky. I've spent the months since then trying to make sense of what happened. I've researched the history of the Carnival Hotel, of Keegan Industries, trying to find some explanation for what I experienced. I haven't found any answers, only more questions. But I do know this. There are some places that are meant to stay abandoned, some doors that should remain closed. The thrill of urban exploration isn't worth the risk of encountering whatever it was I found in that house of mirrors. I don't explore abandoned places anymore. I can't bring myself to. Every time I see my reflection, I find myself searching for that masked figure in the background. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear that soft, rhythmic breathing. To any urban explorers out there who might be reading this, stay away from the Carnival Hotel in Bivouac, Colorado. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some places better left unexplored. Because sometimes when you look into the abyss of an abandoned place, something looks back, and it might just follow you home.